with is a little bit about this, why this is important. And I think one of the reasons it's important, other than kind of the theoretical ones that I'll get at, is just the fact that this is a case where we have seen a rising number of these, the use of drone strikes. And so for those of you in the back, now this large pink bar is Afghanistan. So those are the strikes actually we don't hear much about. And the reason I think we don't hear much about them is because this is happening in the context of an armed conflict. And same with, for example, Libya in 2011. That's the blue bar. So we had a number of drone strikes in Libya, and then a few in Iraq, towards the end of the Iraq conflict. But the ones that have drawn some more attention, and they're really more the focus of this research because of the theoretical basis for it, are these other ones, which are also increasing. So we have those in Pakistan. The first one was in, there weren't that many in the early years after 9/11. The first strike was in Afghanistan in November 2001. Then in Yemen a year later in 2002, Pakistan in 2004. And so this is a relatively recent but burgeoning phenomenon, as I think this kind of gives you the sense of. And it's not just the US that's using this. So this is British drone strikes in Afghanistan, which also haven't received a whole lot of attention. But you can see that this is increasingly a tool of warfare within the British military. And then the Israelis. So these are the three countries that have used drones in combat. So the US, UK, and the Israelis. And this is an increasingly prevalent instrument of war. So Israel just used them a month or two ago in the Sinai. They used them in Gaza. So what we know also is that everyone wants them. For the same reasons the US is increasingly relying on them, other countries now want to jump on this bandwagon. Right? So it makes a whole lot of domestic sense, which I'm going to point to in the subsequent research, which is you have no body bags coming back from war. A lot of literature in political science says that which I'll talk about, the kind of very tangible cost of war in the form of body bags coming home don't manifest itself when drones are used, because they're unmanned. By definition, there are no body bags coming home from war. And so 5 years ago, there were 41 countries with drones. By 2011, 76. Now, most of these are unarmed, unmanned aerial vehicles. And the ones that are really I'm focusing on here are the combat ones. But China, Iran, Italy, France have combat drones. And a number of other countries, essentially the ones that we would care about, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, UAE, are all acquiring combat drones. And so what I want to show here is just that this is an increasingly crowded landscape. And so it's not just what I'll focus on here is the United States, but this is something that I think we need to be coming to terms about, given not just the way the US is using them more frequently, but the fact that it's just the US now, and to other countries, it's increasingly going to be other countries, including US adversaries. So what does that mean? And so the reason why I'm focused on this is because despite the prevalence with which these are being used, we've thought very little in sort of theoretical terms or otherwise about the implications for that. And so that's what this research is doing. And the reason kind of theoretically why this matters is that, again, if we think about democratic accountability, it's based on the fact that there are costs of war in blood and treasure. And democratic populaces don't want to pay those costs. And so when the costs creep up, the domestic populace says, whoa, 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 bring our troops home. And the point is, if there are no troops to bring home, what does that imply in terms of how these wars will take place? Drones, again, are not just no risk to the pilots, but generally cheaper to produce. So if you have an F-22 that's $360 million and a Reaper that's $20 million, you can see kind of the calculus sort of is in favor of the use of drones. So just the questions that I'll cover here with that background in mind are the following. So how does the use of drones affect these democratic accountability mechanisms, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the subsequent slides? And in particular, how does the marketplace of ideas, which is to say kind of these debates about how we're using force in the world, how does that marketplace shape the drone debate? So how are the different voices and different actors and different arguments, how are they resonating with the public? So what's affecting these public attitudes towards why do people love drone strikes, and how, if what they knew these strikes are about, how would that change their opinions? And then which ideas and voices within the marketplace are really resonating with the public? So a brief outline. I know I've talked already for a few minutes, but just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going with the subsequent slides. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about theories of democratic accountability, and then turn to kind of what I want to lay out too is the fact that on this issue of drones, it is kind of a thriving set of debates among the people like Professor Chesney and legal scholars thinking about these issues. And they're really serious people on both sides of them, and both sides of several aspects of this issue. And I want to examine those in brief because they set up the empirical test that we do. And I say we, by the way, because I have two co-authors. One actually on the book is a philosopher who works on the ethics and morality side. And I've not worked on the ethics and morality side. I do the law and politics side. And then I have another co-author that we did some NSF work, funded work, I guess, when the government was functioning, funded our research to do some experiments. So that's the basis of the empirical test. So what we'll look at is what is the role of polls in shaping the debate, and then again, which different voices and arguments are resonating with the public. And there are, I think, important implications not just for theory but for policy, which I'll close with. So again, I talked a little bit about this, the theories of democratic accountability. And one of the things that is thought to make democracies different on a battlefield is that there is this marketplace of ideas. You read the newspaper and the New York Times editorial says something often wildly different than the Wall Street Journal. And this is just one sort of vehicle through which we're getting exposure to different sets of ideas. And the idea is that this is supposed to generate better foreign policy outcomes, right? So we're vetting the ideas, the public gets to wrestle with them, and better outcomes will result, right? Because foolish ideas will get jettisoned and the good ones will stay on the table. And so that's kind of the optimistic view about how democracies work. Now there's one that is less sanguine, which if you're gathering to this point, I'm more in this camp, which is that the marketplace of ideas doesn't always function in the service of free debate that results in better outcomes. And Kaufman, in an article in International Security, talked about this really in the context of the Iraq War, which is, hey, what happened to the marketplace of ideas? It's supposed to function in one way, and it failed miserably because the public, or the media, opposition groups, everyone just sort of, was silent as the drumbeats were marching towards war. And his look is at Iraq, but sort of suggests that theoretically, based on this, that maybe this is how the impotence of the marketplace of ideas in general, and that this marketplace of ideas is lacking the power to really keep the executive's aims in check. And one of the reasons is that leaders have really an asymmetry of information. They can set the terms of the debate. And that's something I think I'll turn to in the first kind of empirical look, which is how leaders are shaping the way the debate takes place. And I think we see evidence for that in this context of drones. So that's the theoretical kind of architecture that this project is playing into. Why do we want to study this in the context of drones? And as I showed earlier, not only is this a technology that a lot of countries are increasingly using, but if we think about what the marketplace of ideas is supposed to embody, this should be a case where we should see it. And there are basically two sets of ideas in tension, two values in tension. If you want to put it in theoretical terms, you have a logic of consequences, whereas does this technology work? Is it effective? And on the one hand, and a logic of appropriateness, which is this ethical, is this moral, is this legal on the other? And what's interesting on this topic is that you get serious people on both sides of these questions. And so what are they saying? First, I want to talk about the consequences. And I'd love to hear in the Q&A different perspectives on this. Here I'm just laying out, again, the terrain of what this marketplace looks like. So we have the question of effectiveness, do drones work? And again, we have the one of appropriate. Are they legal in terms of domestic authorization and international, but also the conduct in conflict? How does this affect civilian treatment in conflict? So on the logic of consequences, let's say effectiveness here. Again, both sides of the issue, you have serious people weighing in on this. On the pro, people say, hey, this is excellent. This has eliminated almost single-handedly key al-Qaeda leaders. One person in OSD I spoke to said that the use of drones has decimated al-Qaeda. And this argument kind of builds on this idea that decapitation strategies, where you eliminate the key leaders and the organization follows, suggest that this is why these drone strikes are working. But there's a con side to this too, is that decapitation strategies really are limited in their impact. And a number of serious people, again, have weighed in on that side. And the mechanism that people point to is that it creates these martyrdom effects, is that the organization goes on, and not only that, but it's actually helping to do this rally effect where you're able to recruit more people, more terrorists, and that it's creating then more terrorists than you're killing through the decapitation. So that's kind of the logic of effectiveness or consequences, if you will. And then I disaggregate this second category into three different aspects. So the first one is the international legal authorization on the recourse to force, if you will, the jus ad bellum. So does the US have, or Israel or Britain, have the international legal authorization to go use drones in Yemen, for example? And the government would say yes, and John Brennan has said, yes, we have the right of self-defense to use drones in this context. A number, however, of international legal scholars have said no, that at least outside areas of hot zones, active conflict, like Afghanistan, these are not legal under international law. This is not an act of anticipatory self-defense to be targeting, in some cases, these low-level leaders, and certainly not in places like Yemen. In other words, calling it a hot zone because we just use force there does not make it internationally legal for it to be a hot zone and to use force there. So that's the first kind of jus ad bellum aspect of appropriateness. The second is whether there's domestic legal authorization. Again, we see both sides here, right? So there's the AUMF. You can tell I was in the military. Lots of acronyms. Authorization for the use of military force allows the government to use force against al-Qaeda, including AQAP, the Arabian Peninsula. And then there are those on the other side, and they're saying, no, the scope of the AUMF is too broad. You can't just go around targeting suspicious behavior of anyone. AQAP actually didn't even exist on 9/11, so how can you claim that this 9/11, post-9/11 authorization counts in terms of targeting groups that weren't even present? And even, in fact, Obama in his speech in May 2003 said, you know, I don't feel comfortable with the fact that this authorization 11 or 12 years after 9/11 is still giving me the power to go kill whomever I want. We should reevaluate that. And actually, interestingly, the Senate, the Congress said that they didn't want him saying that we should reevaluate his executive power, which is sort of another interesting question about the question of accountability and checks and balances, is that Congress is saying, no, please take this power to go kill terrorists. But again, there are people on other sides where they're saying this is just too broad in terms of authorizing leaders to use force. And then the third issue is this jus in bello. So the principle of distinction. And under international law, states need to differentiate between direct active participants in war and those who are not actively involved in war. And they need to, they can target the first, but not the second. And again, the government has said, this was Professor Coe from Yale, who was then the legal advisor to the State Department. and says that this is principal distinction is not something just that's recited at meetings. We actually do this. And I think, to be fair, and this is a question I often get, well, aren't drones better than carpet bombing entire cities? And I think this is sort of a false choice, right? That you can either carpet bomb or you can not be at war. And drones are much better than carpet bombing. And I think the sort of contrary argument to that is this question about the targeting policies, right? And so that's where there have been these counter-arguments about the principle of distinction. Getting at these issues, so you know, well, a lot of this is really difficult because a lot of these policies are classified, right? Which is sort of is part of this argument about how the marketplace of ideas functions, right? So if a lot of this information is classified, how can the marketplace of ideas function? How do opposition groups get access to the kinds of information that they would use to challenge these positions? But what we have seen through kind of a series of, you know, episodic leaks is some information about the drone policies. And the New York Times in particular has come across some interesting tidbits in which the government, you know, is thought to designate combatants as military-aged males in a combat zone, which, you know, a lot of critics will say, well, that's a really broad term, right? So all military-aged males in a combat zone. I mean, you know, if Professor Gavin happened to be, you know,
I wish I was still military-aged. It's quite flattering.
Okay, Josh. But, you know, would you count, should that be, you know, international law people say that that's just not a significant enough criterion to be considered a legal combatant. And then this issue of signature strikes, which I think receives a little bit of attention, in which Professor Busby over here goes and meets with a cleric in Waziristan. And so a signature strike is that kind of behavior is what a terrorist would do. So it's based on patterns of behavior. Now we can target you because you're exhibiting these kinds of terrorist-like behaviors. And so this would be kind of a counter-argument to this principle of distinction, which is this is not compatible with international law. Yes, it may be more precise. We're not carpet bombing people, but we're still hitting people that we're pretty sure are not culpable, or we don't know are culpable. Shouldn't there be a greater burden of proof on this particular issue? So there are a lot of contested claims. Again, you know, Professor Chesney has written in his colleagues in Lawfare at length about these issues. The question is, you know, is that the whole sum of the marketplace of ideas? Okay, so blogs and international law journals are covering this stuff. What about the public at large? And there's an interesting study on the media on the drone policy, which shows that very early on, they did a content analysis of media coverage of drone strikes, very either silent or tacitly approving of drone strikes. But, you know, and so there's some sense that this coverage is changing a little bit, but, you know, 31st of August, a New York Times headline here sort of exemplifies what I'm trying to get at, right? So drone strike is said to kill 4 militants in Pakistan. And the reason why we know it's 4 militants is because the government reports that they killed 4 militants, right? Because we don't necessarily have independent verification of who these people are, you know, and you can say they're a militant because they were in the combat zone. It becomes very tautological, right? You're a militant, you're in a combat zone. So, and so I'm a little dubious about how the media has covered this issue. And what I wanted to focus on then was actually the role of public opinion polls themselves. And so why public opinion polls? You know, to me this is really interesting because, you know, it matters theoretically. They essentially, you know, people have in their minds, they, I think, can think about this particular issue in either one of these two ways. Yeah, I really want to kill terrorists, but I'm not so sure I want to be in violation of international law. And so the reason why how polls are framed is going to matter is because how you frame it is going to kind of trigger and pull and extract whatever kind of issue or ideas are made salient in the question. And so what I did as a first step in thinking through this was I collected all of the, and they're not that that many. All of the public opinion polls on how people feel about the use of drones. And what's really interesting, so again, we know that wording affects matter. So if you ask people how they feel about welfare, they say, well, I don't like welfare because people need to work hard for what they get. But if you ask about assistance to the poor, you think, oh gosh, these people are poor, they need help. And so you get very different response rates depending on how you ask the question. I think, the people in American politics know that. And that's not what I'm necessarily trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is that potentially based on what assumptions you're building into it, not just wording, but the assumptions that you're building into these questions can be drawing people and pulling people in a certain way. And when I looked at these questions, what's interesting is there's never a question about the legal basis, and there's certainly not any issue about or question about compatibility with international law, especially this issue of civilians. And the typical formulation kind of is the poll version of that New York Times article I just showed you. So, do you approve or disapprove of the Obama administration using drones to kill high-level terrorism suspects overseas? And again, for people, Professor Chesney, nerds like myself that are doing this all the time, you know that this kind of assumption, the fact that these are high-level terrorists, is a pretty disputable assumption. And yet this is the way that these questions are phrased. And so what you get is, these are all the polls, and I tried to highlight in red here. They range between 60 and 86% support. And you don't have to scrutinize everyone, but basically it's a pretty high level of support. And in fact, I just did a nationally representative sample, and 70% of people support the use of drones. And I did use the wording, very similar wording. So this is pretty interesting. I mean, it's a pretty high level of support. And so what I wanted to do here is kind of test this argument that I'm kind of starting to build here, which is, what would happen if you told people that, in fact, there are some features of this policy that you may, find objectionable? How does that affect, people's views, right? And again, the polls are mattering because they're contributing to this, the terrain or the landscape of the marketplace. So, the Washington Post reports, media outlets, that the American public loves drones. Well, they're absolutely right. The thing is, are they really getting at people's concerns about them? And so if it becomes reverberated, this becomes part of the discourse. So the test then of how how attitudes are shaped by these assumptions, what I did, and this I did actually on my own, so I'm saying I now, is to test how these assumptions are shaping attitudes. I used the main wording of the sort of standard Gallup poll. Do you support these strikes to target suspected terrorists? And then I modified two aspects of the policy that correspond to that discussion earlier about these features of the policy. So the one was about legal authorization. So questions about whether the Congress has authorized this, questions about whether this is authorized under international law, and then the treatment of civilians. So I looked at how people felt when you mentioned that the definition of a combatant is a military-age male or someone exhibiting patterns of terrorist behavior. And what I found was pretty surprising to me. I mean, I knew that kind of focusing on certain features of the policy would affect people's attitudes, but not to the extent that they did. So the most significant, as I'll show in a more digestible graph here in a second, is actually the treatment of civilians. People actually were not as impressed with the international legal authorization and whether they're allowed under international law, whether we are allowed to target people in Yemen. But they really cared about treatment of civilians in the context of war. So when you mention the signature strikes or military-age males, support for drone strikes goes down by 36% in the first case and 23% in the second. And so this is the control group here, which is in this poll almost 60%, and these are the treatments. So when you kind of replace when you replace terrorists with military-age males, you get this level of decline in support. So the second aspect of this, this empirical test then deals with a different, again, these sets of ideas and these contested claims. But I organized this one around these kind of behavioral logics, you know, the effectiveness and the appropriateness. And which of these ideas is really resonating with people? Do they care more about the effectiveness, or do they care more about kind of the legitimacy of what's going on? And so on each of those, again, corresponding with the discussion earlier, I included a pro and a con. And the second that I'm now bringing into this is the question of voices. And so on this issue of drones, you know, so you have the government, you have John Brennan coming out when he's about to be confirmed, I guess, in his confirmation hearings to be the CIA director, coming out and talking about, or in 2012, you know, what different, why this is legal, legitimate behavior. But, you know, there are other voices in the marketplace, and what we wanted to see was which of these voices, which of these alternative voices are people finding credible, what's resonating with people. And so we looked at the government as a credible voice on this. And then we looked at the UN as an international organization that is probably thought to be credible by some on this issue. And then NGOs, a bunch of non-government organizations like Human Rights Watch have been publishing reports on this issue. So the way we set this up was we varied the source here, the government, UN, and NGOs, and then these two behavioral logics, effectiveness and the use ad bellum and use in bello, pro and con for each, and want to see kind of, again, what's resonating with the public here. Consistent with the last experiment, what we found here is that individuals, again, are pretty concerned, actually, with civilian casualties, not as concerned with sovereignty issues. I don't think they seem animated about whether we're in Yemen or not, but they really do care about civilian casualties. And the source of the ideas matters. So the elite cues we were surprised to find don't really resonate. And I was really puzzling through this, and I think it's because actually when you take it together with the first experiment I was showing, I think what's happening is people are taking already as a given the view, the kind of government position on these. So you find no difference when the government, so when you replace in this previous one, so you have the government saying, yeah, we should do drones because they're really killing a lot of terrorists. To add that to the question doesn't have any effect on people's views. I think it's because they're already kind of thinking in that terms, right? In those terms. But NGOs and international organizations, when you have the UN or an NGO that is voicing its concerns about civilian casualties, that actually is swaying the public quite a bit. This one I'm presenting a little bit differently. This is a different, the decrease in support. So what you see here, these are sovereignty, this is sovereignty, and this is civilian treatment. And that's the UN, the NGO, and the government. So the government is operating in the direction you would expect, which is when the government says something and the people are sort of responding, but they're not, that's not hugely consequential. But these two outside voices on the issue on sovereignty and civilian treatment are actually affecting people quite a bit. And what's interesting is that we were very subtle in the way we phrased those treatments. It was very much like, the UN thinks that this may not be compatible with international law because of the treatment of civilians. And this is having, I think, a pretty substantial effect, you know, between 6 and 8% decline in support. So let me wrap up with some thoughts on what this means, again, kind of bringing it back to the marketplace of ideas, theoretically, but also in terms of policy. And again, I think this is, there's not been a whole lot of work in political science on this topic, so I don't want to say that this is by any means the last word, but I think that I wanted to start somewhere, and so I started with the marketplace of ideas, and I think what it does show is that the marketplace is shaping ideas, and that comes in a number of different forms. It comes based on what assumptions are embedded in polls, and how that's constraining the ideological space of the drone debate, and contributing to this prevailing view that then just kind of gets reverberated and echoed that people love drone strikes, so let's keep doing them. And you know, if you think about polls as a set of sort of incentives that leaders consider, at least when they make decisions, that then provides the political incentives to act a certain way or another. And what was interesting too is that NGOs and IOs can actually affect the terms of this debate as well. What we were also a little surprised by was the fact that even on this question, like one of the foremost questions right now on the use of force, which should, you know, you would think actually, at least theoretically, that issues of law and appropriateness wouldn't be very consequential, and it turns out actually they are. It's not, people don't only care about whether we're killing the bad guys, they care about how we're doing it. And then implications for policy, I think, are there as well. You know, whether you're an NGO or IO, you know, they should probably keep doing the work that they're doing because it's probably affecting how people are thinking about these questions. And even in terms of the polls themselves, you know, if you're Gallup, you don't want to be in the business of manipulating opinion, but they should probably consider the way in which their assumptions are affecting this top-line view of how the public feels about strikes, because it affects apparent support for strikes. And just lastly, some closing thoughts is that, as I mentioned at the outset, the theories of democratic accountability assume kind of that this marketplace of ideas is working and people are exposed to competing views. And I think what this suggests is that those views are out there. Again, Professor Chesney is writing about them, I'm writing about them, but I don't know that you know, Gallup is not writing about them, the New York Times, you know, and so I want to downplay the effect that lawfare is having on the discourse, because I think it is actually. But I think in terms of sort of the big outlets, the media, the polls, it's certainly not, it's not subjecting this particular policy to the type of scrutiny that I think has been theorized for democratic institutions. And so the question is, I think, what is the result of this? And kind of if you work backwards from the assumption that visible costs of war and a thriving marketplace of ideas on a particular issue is going to constrain, you know, and cause democracies to really think hard about the choices they're making, I think that what this would suggest is that the use of force can kind of be at a lower threshold, that these wars can continue without that same scrutiny as they would in the context where the costs of war are much more visible. And I think as drones, as they proliferate, I think these consequences will become even more significant. So I know I've kind of thrown a lot out there. I'd be happy to talk about any of the empirical stuff or the theoretical mechanisms and hear from you about what you think. I think that's it.
Want to handle your own questions? No, we do. Great. Well, I'm sure there's tons of questions, and hopefully we can try to get to the student questions. And I'd like to start out with a student. You're a student, right?
I am. So it seems like one of the main ideas of democratic accountability is that the costs are incurred by the democracy itself. But it seems like in this model, a lot of the costs are actually extended to another country. So whether it be Yemen, whether it be Afghanistan, whether it be civilians in other countries. And so it seems like the accountability is not as much of a democracy as it is. I mean, do we as citizens account for the cost to Yemen, to Afghanistan, as opposed to if we see body bags coming home, that's a much higher cost for a political official.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question because yeah. So I don't want to again imply that I want my sons going off to war, coming back and or your brothers, neighbors. I'm not trying to suggest that. But what I am saying is that because the other is being killed, people don't think of it in the same way. And all of these mechanisms really do rely on us bearing the cost. And again, it's a good thing that our people aren't being killed, but we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that others aren't being killed. You know, so there have been 300 drone strikes that have killed 3,000 militants and others, and a host of, you know, hundreds of others. And so I think those costs really do need to be considered, but it's clear that they're not considered by a domestic audience. You know, so when you look, for example, at how people feel about domestic surveillance, right? And this is just something that people get so anxious about. And yet they don't get anxious about this issue. And yet, so one is having this sort of big brother thing that people, it's clear that all politics is local in this context. And I think you're right. I think this, given that all politics is local, I think we need to consider that there is another set of politics. There are other body bags that just aren't American flags on them.
Josh?
So I wanted to raise an issue for you. One of your a couple of your polls that had lower numbers had a significant proportion of people that said they didn't know. And in other studies looking at the role of elite cues and persuasive effects often think about distinction between low information voters and high information voters, whether it's Zoller or others. And I wonder if you've done any tests to see about sort of moderating effects of, or the mediating effects of information on whether or not that matters in terms of the responsiveness to elite cues, because I think that would be helpful. And then the other thing is that there's sort of a, I don't know if it's a confound, but the fact that I think the partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans would probably be different if you didn't have a sitting Democratic president as this technology emerged, because I think the natural inclination might be for both a more vociferous and critical media and sort of critical left, but the fact that Obama's in office and he's presiding over this sort of increase or increase in maybe decline, that has given him some sort of Democratic cushion on the left. So I want to raise that issue, and I'd like just to hear a little bit more about if these experiments were carried out with student samples or adult samples. Is this knowledge networks, or is this in the student lab, or just thinking about external validity?
No, those are great questions. We just got field data back from a knowledge networks survey of 2,000 Americans, so nationally representative, and we were really kicking ourselves because we included a neither support nor oppose category, and a third of the respondents are in that category. Right, so this really we need to think about, and we just got this back 2 weeks ago, and I was like, I have this talk coming up, we gotta move this along here, folks. So we haven't explored this and prodded, but I think we need to do that, because what is that telling us? I think it's telling us, I think you're right, something about elite cues, but I think in some ways it's telling us too that people are sort of maybe conflicted about this, because they do have this tension of, well, that it's great that they say that we're killing terrorists, but a little ambivalent or uneasy about what the consequences are. So I think we need to think about this a little bit more and maybe kind of disaggregate by low information voters, high information voters, partisanship. And I think you're right. I'm not sure how we can get at this other than just time taking care of it in 3 years. You know, because I don't think drone strikes are going away, and so we'll have, I guess, some way of evaluating whether it's exactly what you're saying. Because my hunch is that that's given the policy a bit more of a pass than it might have otherwise. I mean, this Nobel Peace Prize winner is doing this. That must mean that it gives it this legitimation. Is maybe how it's viewed. And I think you're right. And the partisan differences, yeah, we need to think about that. But I appreciate those comments.
You mentioned episodic leaks, and I was just wondering, do you see the administration or the source of those episodic leaks as kind of confounding the informational exchange of ideas and trying to manipulate it? And have you done any testing against your polls in terms of the timing of particular leaks and content of leaks versus the results of the polling?
It's really interesting. It's something that I should look at, because I think that the timing of this probably does affect how people feel. So the polls in February and March, when this confirmation hearing was going on, and there was like a big media blitz, you can track it on Google data to show basically when the peak in coverage on an issue was, and the peak coverage for drones was February, March of this year. But I'll have to give this some thought as to how these, I mean, I think your point though is a really interesting one, which is, you know, is this view, in some ways, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like some of what you're suggesting is that, you know, we do have alternative views out there because this stuff is getting out, right? It's not just this totally classified thing. So there is more debate, and I think in that sense too, I don't want to be too pessimistic about democracies because it's probably still more open and transparent than non-democracies. I think it's not quite as transparent as this sort of ideal type of what we might think the discourse should be. But it's a great question.
So you know a lot more about polls than I do. So I was just curious how you would answer the Gallup question. So the Gallup question that's given, do you approve or disapprove of killing high-level terrorists? I would know that this isn't really what they mean when they're asking the question, right? I would suspect they're not high-level terrorists. It might have collateral damage, it might have martyrdom effects, it might not be in the combat zone, all of these other things. And I would be like, how the hell do I answer this question? Because if I know I'm killing a high-level terrorist who hates the United States, I'm going to say I approve. How would you answer the question?
How would you answer it? You would say yes?
I would probably say, but I don't know what the right answer to give is, because, you know, I would want to express all this skepticism.
Right? Which is that let's give people let's inform them as we're giving them this. I'm not quite going so far as to say that paternalistically, let's tell them what the real story is, but let's give them a little more information. Okay, so if we're killing a few civilians in the process, what do you think about killing some high-level terrorists? Right. So that in some ways, what I think I'm suggesting is that the question should be a little more informative, right? So it shouldn't just be, are we killing high-level terrorists? It should be, these are some other things that are going on at the same time. Do you still support killing the high-level terrorists? And then kind of, you know, because people invariably, you know, on the question of like taxes and services, people always say, I want more services and fewer taxes. And you can't have that, right? Like, which do you want? Well, maybe you can. I don't know what's going on in our government, but no, they don't seem to know either. But so I think it's a great point. Maybe that's why so many are in this ambivalent kind of middle, thinking about it. But that's also why this marketplace of ideas is probably influential, is because if people are, it's an issue where people, you know, in American politics would call the ambivalence axiom, that people can kind of see both sides of it. And I think this issue in some ways embodies that. So if you're a voice out there in the marketplace, then you can, people, it's not like, dare I say, like the issue of abortion, where people probably are pretty anchored to what they think. You know, drones is a new issue, and they're really good arguments on both sides. So these voices in the marketplace can actually have a pretty big impact.
So leaving aside your experiments that you did, do you have a question that you would like Gallup to run? Like, to replace the dumb Gallup question with Sarah Kreps, this is what I think you should run.
Do you have some money?
Not
That's like $20,000 right there.
Yeah, right, not that kind.
That's why I haven't even thought about that. No, but I guess I would do more along those lines of you know, because there are a lot of questions. I was looking for my backup slides. I'm not going to bother you with that. But there have been 3 questions about how people feel about civilian casualties, collateral damage. And between 84 and 94% of people say this is of concern for them. But that's not the question. That's the question of, like, do you want lower taxes? Yes, I want lower taxes. You have to ask people, do you support these conditional on it doing that to civilians? And so that's, I think, what I would get at, those trade-offs.
Is there any sense that people's sentiments are following how the law is thinking about it, in the sense that when this first came up, it was sort of a legal black hole, lawyers are still struggling with this. Presumably, when you poll people, they care about the law, although this is a pretty that there's any kind of interaction between the public opinion and the legal reasoning thinking as the legal world kind of comes to terms with this?
No, it's an interesting question because I think it is very arcane. And people, so I wrote a blog post again, the marketplace, who knows if we're reading blogs, but about public opinion and where these strikes are occurring. And no one knows. No one knows where these things are happening. So I think it's also an issue where people are just so, even on the basic question of where are these strikes happening, and more people either got it wrong or didn't know than knew the right answer. And that's sort of basic. And so this legal issue then, that's really, I think, a stretch for people. Although it's what's also interesting is, last weekend, 2 weekends ago, how they, this raid that the Navy SEALs conducted, and they brought one of the guys onto a Navy ship, and that's where they're interrogating him. So it had been this question of, well, we can't detain people because Guantanamo and the CIA black sites kind of were a little bit of a blemish on our PR. And drones, so to this question is, so we can't capture them, that means we're killing them, because then we don't have to deal with that legal issue. But then this kind of became a little sticky too with the negative PR on, because there's great data showing that the rest of the world hates these things, other than those who are buying them. The others, people in Pakistan and Yemen hate them, and those are the people that we're trying to, I think, not have hate us.
That's a pretty bad sort of sense where international law says it's better to kill people than capture them. You have a better killing option from the international law perspective than you do from
But now we're going to capture them and see how that goes, I guess.
Yeah, well, it didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
So my question is more about the human side of it. So you were talking about how there were no body bags coming back. So once more veterans start to emerge out of this who are involved with drone strikes, do you think that that's going to increase sort of the governmental side, or is it going to kind of be a calculated, maybe this isn't great because the anonymity is detrimental, or
And do you mean the pilots themselves?
Yeah, pilots themselves who, maybe would have been in combat but now are in, a room somewhere. So it's more like, sort of sense.
Oh, that's something, this year at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we have 5 military fellows that I am chatting with all the time because I've been in the ivory tower for 5 years. But no, more than that, I guess, 10. I don't know, when was it? 2003 I started in my PhD. And so I really want to know more about this. My sense is that the military is still coming to terms with what this actually means. And the Air Force is dealing with its pilots, RPA pilots, remote piloted aircraft, remotely piloted aircraft in different ways than the Navy, and the Navy now has them in the Army. I don't think they've really come to terms with it. I know there are studies that the DoD has done showing that there actually is like PTSD from the pilots that fly these things. But I just don't know that that has been given careful attention. But I think it's an important consideration in all of this. How is that affect? What's that human side look like?
And how if their voices will become sort of relevant in this marketplace.
Oh, interesting. So far my sense is that the military is not, at least in the Air Force, which I know more about, is that the fighter pilots are where it's at. If you're a bomber pilot, that's okay too. But I think that our RPA pilots, I'm not. Yeah, I don't think they have kind of this. What's the word? Yes. Yeah. Right. That would give them this kind of like
Tom Cruise
imprimatur.
hasn't played one of them yet, so. Tom Cruise is not in that.
Right. Yeah, what's Tom Cruise?
Then you're
He's an
stuck.
RPA pilot, right? Or Tom Hanks.
Hey, thanks so much, sir. That was a really interesting presentation.
But
And I'll just. This is going to be a softball question in some sense because I'm just really curious what you think. I'll start by noting in passing that, from what I can tell, abortion questions are notoriously malleable depending on how you phrase the stuff. So I think that indicates that what you're studying is sort of absolutely sort of the thing to be looking at with public opinion. And sort of what your research reinforces to me is that there seems to be a lot of truth in this idea that, to the extent that the public has opinions, it's very much elite-driven, which is that the elites can frame these questions basically in the public debate in different ways. I think Josh is absolutely right. Obama does a great job of this. He's basically defanged the left. He gives these spectacular speeches. Nothing really happens, right? But everyone quiets down for a while. And so I guess I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about, how this might be sort of a more robust market-based place might be advanced in public debate? Would it help if, sort of in the traditional way, one of the parties or major figures took stands that framed the issue in these ways? And what jumps to my mind is, the Rand Paul intervention, right? I would guess that's approximately when the news media coverage spiked. That's certainly when I started to think about it again, right? And although he was focused on a somewhat different set of issues than you surveyed on, it certainly got everyone talking about it, and you suddenly started to hear, at least in my mind, all these kind of different arguments. And so I guess I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Did that really happen? Am I making that up? And do you think that this would essentially be the mechanism by which your kind of sort of research might make its presence felt?
that's a great question, and you're right that in the Gallup poll, it's a neat before and after, the pre and post Rand, or Paul, how does he go by? I guess Rand because he's not wrong. But a decline by 20 percentage points in support, which is pretty extraordinary, except that, I mean, maybe you're right, maybe all of this is just malleable, and so these elite views are very influential. I would say that voices like members of Congress, NGOs and IOs too, of course, but maybe they're not, and they would actually, members of Congress would be an interesting kind of source credibility factor to test, right? So, people have certain views about, Human Rights Watch, they're just like this, left-wing loony group, or the UN, they want to just take our guns. But then, a member of Congress, a senator, right? How do people view his
Some
or
of our
her?
congressmen in Texas believe those things.
I've received literature on it since I've come to Texas.
But the credibility of the messengers may vary by subgroup. So they may be partisan lenses. So Republicans might trust Rand Paul, but Democrats might trust Human Rights Watch. So the amplification of any elite messengers might really depend on who the target is.
But the problem is, and this is I guess where I was going on the member of Congress thing. So I think you're right. Those would be the voices that would be influential. I don't think they're going to try to be influential, and there are just huge incentives for them not to be, right? So as this Stanford political scientist Ken Schultz has written, and I think it's absolutely right, Congress gets really little credit for foreign policy successes, but they get a lot of blame when things go badly. So if you're the member of Congress, what you just don't want, do no harm, right? It should be kind of their Hippocratic thing, is let's just not have a terrorist attack on my watch, right? Because then they'll just vote the bums out. And so what's the kind of safe approach? Okay, let's be silent on this drones thing, right? And then actually a couple of senators, Angus King from Maine, an independent, has been pretty vociferous on this. I think they just consider him as this crazy guy from Maine, who's an independent, right? Because he's calling for these independent courts. And it's in fact, actually, if anyone in the judiciary has tried to, particular judges when these court cases come up, I mean, the outcome is always really predetermined, right? It's, what's the national secrets clause of, so they always rely on, government really has the prerogative on that. And the particular judges have said, I really don't feel comfortable with this, but I have to do it. And they, and they basically go with what the government has its position is, but I just don't, in some ways, think the incentives are there to advocate for the alternative policies. I don't know, we can talk about it later. That's a great question.
I have a question about the potential for new voices in the marketplace regarding the relatively new move of Al Jazeera America. And in one way, being able to bring the discussion of drones kind of to the forefront of their discussion, and then two, actually showing some of the damage that the more domestic media outlets tend to not show. But I know that's very conditional given maybe the lack of trust that the general public has. So just what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, it's a really interesting outlet to consider because all of our colleagues in American politics have looked at U.S. media sources. Do you trust the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal? But it'll be interesting to see the effect of the arrival of these kinds of new media sources, and even outlets like the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and these groups that actually will go out into Waziristan and find out who these people were, right? And so that wasn't happening at the beginning, and now you can go and kind of verify, because these FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information Act requests, the government responded and said, there's no unclassified data we can provide on these strikes. And so other groups have gone out and done literally the groundwork for them. And so it's an interesting question how that percolates in people's minds, new media sources, different sources of information, and the effect, which is I think why actually in Germany in particular, the use of drones, which they were in the process of acquiring armed drones, is fairly controversial because of these kinds of questions.
Okay, why don't we collect like 3 or 4 and give you one final
My
shot?
response is too long.
Could you look at your crystal ball and what do your threat experts say? When is the first civilian aircraft in the world going to go down caused by a drone? What do you hear from them?
We'll add them up.
You just touched upon Germany, and I'm here at the LBJ School as a German exchange student, and we actually have a very controversial debate on this. And it started about a year ago, and it goes exactly in the opposite direction as it goes here in the US. Well, you imply that the media here tacitly agree to drone strikes, and also that's the way the polls are framed. I would say it's the exact opposite in Germany, and if you want to support armed drone strikes in Germany, you have a tough standing. So my question is, do you have any explanations on how it started, why the debate would develop in such a direction, such an opposite direction in Germany or in other European countries as it did here in the US?
A quick follow-up to that, which is, I was wondering somewhat the same thing but about the UK, where they actually do use drones. So is this kind of a very American thing that we're observing, or in the UK where they also, because Germany has its own issues with their views on warfighting, but in the UK, do you also see this, or is the situation very different? Because I think that comparative perspective would be interesting. And then a quick note, I think one thing that struck me is with this whole concept of the costs up to warfare don't lie where the actual democratic control is. It reminds me of the use of mercenaries. I mean, that's kind of brings up the same problem, right? So is there something in the kind of historical treatment of mercenaries that could explain how people react to warfare done by them? I'm thinking maybe even of the debate that you had about 10 years ago about private security companies doing basic outsourcing warfare, how that changes the debate, because I think I see some parallels there.
Maybe the final one.
Final question. Yeah, would you be able to extend some of your results to sort of the national debate? 42 states have proposed legislation and some have passed legislation, Texas being one of them. But it's a Class C misdemeanor to spy on your neighbor. It's not really involving armed drones in the U.S. So privacy seems to be a concern here, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
These are all great questions. Let me try to be quick. So in this project I'm doing for the Council on Foreign Relations on proliferation, one of the things we're trying to really tease out is how hard is it to just do it yourself kit. Everyone can buy a drone on Amazon. In fact, in New York this weekend there was a big drone, did you see that?
Yes.
Fair where this 14-year-old, demonstrated this drone he had built. And in fact, there was this moment of drama where one crashed in the Manhattan streets by NYU. And so I think it's a good question. I don't think it's hard to do, and I'm sure our Air Force colleague here would be able to comment on this better, but I don't think it's hard to do. And Army did, I don't know, 5 years? I don't know, maybe not to shoot down a civilian aircraft, but I don't think it's that remote. And so I do think that issue of dealing with kind of these security ramifications of not just other states, but non-states with this technology is something, or even the new thing, I guess, is swarming, where you just get a ton of these just low-grade, low-tech things, and just swarm a radar, and just bring down the radar, so now your planes are flying around, and they don't even know where to go. So that doesn't even involve a combat, and I think that's not that hard to do at all. I think you could get a bunch of, like, Boston-style, Boston bomber-style nuts to get together on Amazon and buy some stuff, and I mean, like, they just had a pressure cooker, right? So this is all commercially available, and you just swarm these things at something high value. I think you can do a lot of damage pretty easily. The Germany question and UK for that matter are really interesting because I framed this in kind of democratic theory, and these comments suggest that this may be more peculiar to the U.S. and may not travel to other countries, and especially, Germany is a really interesting case where you have this inverse set of arguments. I've been following the UK a little bit because there's a guy, Chris Cole, in the UK who does Drone Wars UK, and he's really been collecting a lot of data on the way and where the Brits have been using drones in Afghanistan. It's really interesting because no one in the United States cares about how we're using drones in Afghanistan. To the extent that people care, it's like Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia. But in Britain, I think the debate is, hey, how is this changing how we use military force in Afghanistan, which is sort of most people think, or many people think, is a more legitimate place to be using force. So I think it's a good question of how this travels across other countries. And whether this is a U.S. story or whether there are similarities across countries. And then the last on privacy. That's, again, I think a really interesting question, and one on which people really have different competing views, right? So, again, I'm living in New York, so I was reading this story about cameras in tall apartment buildings, and people are just so conflicted about it, except that they say if it's going to make me safer, yeah, just put as many cameras in there as you want, just not in the elevators. And so, like, and on poll data and surveillance, it really is interesting. People just seem really to not be in favor of it seems very much to value the issue of privacy. Oh, this last question on mercenaries I thought was really interesting too, because it ties a little bit to what I think is maybe a longitudinal issue, right? Is whether it's mercenaries or going from a conscript force to an all-volunteer force. These are just different sides of the same coin, right? They're all different ways of shielding the public from the financial cost of war. We don't have war taxes anymore. I mean, it used to be we'd fight a war and we'd have a war tax. We don't have those anymore. And so I think this is right, that we're more and more kind of removed from the battlefield, and this is just kind of another manifestation of that.
Great, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating. We've learned a ton, and thank you very much.